Luzon, Philippine Islands, February 1945. A Japanese military nurse stood frozen as an African-American medic approached. Everything she had been taught promised death at this moment. Instead, he offered water and unwrapped a bandage. When his hand touched her wounded arm, she blushed crimson. Not from fear, from the sudden collapse of every lie she had ever believed about the enemy standing before her. February 14, 1945. Cabanatuan Region, Luzon. The liberation of the Philippines brought unexpected encounters between worlds that had been separated by oceans of propaganda. Among the prisoners processed by advancing American forces were Japanese military personnel who had never imagined they would live to see captivity. For the women among them, nurses who had served in field hospitals across the Pacific Islands, the prospect of capture had meant something worse than death, according to everything their training had promised. Nurse Kimiko Tanaka, captured near Clark Field, had spent 3 days hiding in damaged hospital buildings before American forces discovered her makeshift shelter. She expected immediate execution. Her training had been explicit. Western colonial forces, particularly those from subjugated populations serving their masters, would show no mercy. The propaganda films screened during her military nursing training had depicted American forces, especially African-American soldiers, as barbaric subhumans who delighted in atrocity. When the medic from the 93rd Infantry Division found her, she closed her eyes and waited for death. Instead, she heard words in halting but recognizable Japanese. Daijobu desu, Isha desu. You are safe. I am a doctor. The medical examination that followed violated every expectation programmed into her consciousness. The medic, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell from Georgia, conducted a professional assessment of her injuries with the same clinical detachment he would have shown an American patient. A shrapnel wound in her left arm required cleaning and bandaging. Dehydration needed a dressing. Minor burns on her hands needed salve. Throughout the examination, Nurse Tanaka kept her eyes downcast, her face burning with color that had nothing to do with fever. The cognitive dissonance between her training and her reality created a psychological earthquake. Every gentle touch of the medic's hands contradicted years of indoctrination. When he offered her a Hershey chocolate bar after finishing the bandaging, she began to weep. Sergeant Mitchell had seen this reaction before. In his 3 months processing prisoners in the Luzon campaign, he had encountered dozens of Japanese prisoners whose breakdown came not from harsh treatment, but from its absence. The collapse of their propaganda worldview often proved more devastating than physical wounds. The Foundation of Deception, Tokyo, 1941-1945. To understand that blush, that moment of profound embarrassment, requires understanding the architecture of lies that had been constructed in the minds of Japanese military personnel throughout the Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese propaganda machine had crafted a specific narrative about race, empire, and the inevitable fate awaiting those who fell into enemy hands. Japanese military training films portrayed American soldiers as representatives of a declining, mongrel civilization. Special emphasis was placed on African-American service members, who were depicted as primitive tools of white colonial masters, lacking education, discipline, or human feeling. The message was clear and repeated constantly. Capture meant torture, violation, and death. Better to die by your own hand than experience what awaited in American custody. For Japanese military nurses, the propaganda carried additional layers. They were told that their gender would afford them no protection, that Western forces had no concept of honor toward women, and that their fate, if captured, would be unspeakable. The specific emphasis on African-American troops as particularly dangerous reflected the racial theories that had underpinned Japanese imperialism throughout Asia. The propaganda built upon existing Japanese racial attitudes while adding new dimensions of terror. Military training included explicit instructions: save the last bullet for yourself, use a grenade, jump from a cliff, anything rather than fall into enemy hands alive. Surrender equaled dishonor worse than death. Capture by Black American troops equaled dishonor, plus unimaginable suffering. This indoctrination was systematic and thorough. Nurse Tanaka, like thousands of her colleagues, had been shown photographs allegedly depicting American atrocities. She had sat through lectures describing the inevitable fate of prisoners. She had been taught that the Western concept of Geneva Conventions was propaganda designed to lure Japanese soldiers into capture so they could be tortured more efficiently. The architects of this propaganda understood psychology. They knew that soldiers who believed death was better than capture would fight more desperately. They knew that nurses who feared capture more than death would continue serving even in hopeless situations. The lies serve strategic purposes, but propaganda only works until reality intervenes. The 93rd Infantry Division, America's segregated warriors. The African American soldiers who contradicted Japanese propaganda with quiet professionalism carried their own burden of contradictions. The 93rd Infantry Division, one of only 2 African American divisions to serve in the Pacific Theater, represented both American military strength and American moral failure. Activated in 1942, the 93rd was composed primarily of African American enlisted men led by white officers, though some black officers held positions in the division structure. These men had volunteered or been drafted to defend a nation that denied them basic civil rights. They trained in segregated facilities, ate in segregated mess halls, and were prohibited from drinking from the same water fountains as white soldiers on their own bases. When the 93rd deployed to the Pacific in early 1944, they carried weapons to fight an external enemy, while carrying wounds from an internal one. They had grown up in a Jim Crow America, where black men were lynched for looking at white women wrong, where public facilities were marked whites only, where voting rights were systematically denied, and where the law offered no protection against racial violence. Yet they served with professionalism that would have surprised their Japanese enemies had those enemies understood the full context. The same military that segregated them also trained them to standards that demanded professional treatment of enemy prisoners. The same nation that denied them dignity at home required them to extend dignity to captured enemies abroad. The 93rd's deployment to the Pacific came after service in the Treasury and Solomon Islands, including combat operations on Bougainville. By the time units from the division reached the Philippines in late 1944 and early 1945, they had accumulated combat experience and casualty lists. They had buried friends and treated wounded enemies according to military regulations that many of them could have been forgiven for questioning. The division's medical and support units, including those responsible for POW processing in the Luzon campaign, maintained standards that reflected their training, despite every reason for bitterness. Staff Sergeant Mitchell and men like him had taken the same Hippocratic oath that white doctors took. They applied the same Geneva Conventions that white officers studied. They extended the same basic human decency that was denied them in their home country. This created one of history's profound ironies. African American soldiers, themselves victims of a racist system, treating enemy prisoners with a humanity and professionalism that directly contradicted the racist propaganda those prisoners had been taught about them. The blush of Japanese nurses like Nurse Tanaka reflected their dawning awareness of this irony, even if they could not fully articulate it. February 15, 1945, POW Processing Camp, Luzon. The days following capture brought a systematic dismantling of propaganda through routine military procedure. Nurse Tanaka and other Japanese prisoners were processed according to standard protocols established by the U.S. Army and consistent with Geneva Convention's requirements. Medical examinations came first. The wounded received treatment regardless of severity or enemy status. Sergeant Mitchell and his colleagues in the 93rd Division medical units treated Japanese prisoners with the same clinical competence they applied to American wounded. Fractures were set. Infections were addressed with the sulfanilamide that had revolutionized battlefield medicine. Serious cases were transferred to better equipped facilities. The treatment itself became a form of psychological warfare, more effective than any propaganda leaflet. Each professional interaction, each medical procedure performed competently, each meal provided, each Geneva Convention's requirement met, struck at the foundation of Japanese military indoctrination. Nurse Tanaka watched as a corporal from the 93rd Division, a man named William Thomas from Philadelphia, carefully administered morphine to a Japanese soldier with a severe leg wound. The soldier had been screaming in pain, anticipating the torture he believed imminent. The relief that flooded his face when the morphine took effect carried a bewilderment that Nurse Tanaka recognized in herself. The chocolate bars became symbolic. In Japanese propaganda, American soldiers were depicted as hungry for resources, stealing food from conquered territories. The reality of American abundance, represented by something as simple as a Hershey bar given to prisoners, contradicted the narrative of a struggling enemy desperate for resources. Language barriers created frustrations, but basic communication happened through gestures, the few Japanese phrases some American soldiers had learned, and the universal language of medical care. "Itai?" asked Sergeant Mitchell, pointing to a wound. "Pain?" Nurse Tanaka found herself nodding, then feeling the blush rise again as she recognized how naturally she was communicating with someone she had been trained to see as incapable of human speech. The processing camp itself contradicted expectations. There were no torture implements, no execution grounds, no evidence of the atrocities promised by propaganda. Instead, there were orderly tents, medical facilities, regular meals, and guards who maintained professional distance without cruelty. Other Japanese prisoners showed similar reactions. A lieutenant who had expected immediate execution upon capture found himself playing cards with his American guards on the third day of captivity, communicating through gestures and broken phrases in both languages. A private who had hidden for weeks in the jungle, too terrified of capture to surrender, wept with relief when he finally understood that survival was possible. For the Japanese military nurses, the experience carried additional complexity. They had been trained to see their role as sacred service to the emperor, requiring absolute loyalty even unto death. Survival itself felt like betrayal, yet the alternative they had been promised, the reason death had seemed preferable, was proving to be fiction. Nurse Tanaka began talking with other prisoners, comparing experiences. All reported the same pattern: professional treatment, adequate food, medical care, absence of torture. The propaganda had been comprehensive lies. This realization brought not relief but a different kind of pain. The recognition of betrayal by their own leadership, by the system they had trusted absolutely. The medical units, professional standards in a segregated army. The 93rd Division's medical personnel operated under multiple layers of contradiction that would have paralyzed a less disciplined force. They were trained to world-class standards while being denied equal status in their own military. They were expected to maintain Geneva Convention's protocols while serving a nation that did not protect their basic human rights at home. The medical training was rigorous. Sergeant Mitchell had completed the same curriculum as white medics, studying anatomy, battlefield medicine, triage protocols, and treatment procedures. His examination of Nurse Tanaka's wounds followed textbook protocol: assess for immediate life threats, control bleeding, prevent infection, address pain, document injuries. The irony was not lost on Mitchell or his colleagues. Many of them had experienced inadequate medical care in civilian life because of segregation. In the South, where Mitchell grew up, black patients entered hospitals through separate doors, received care in separate wards, and often died from treatable conditions because white doctors refused to treat them, and black doctors lacked resources. Yet here in the Philippines, Mitchell was providing first-rate medical care to enemy soldiers who had been taught he was subhuman. The professional satisfaction of practicing medicine correctly mixed with bitter awareness of the system's hypocrisy. The Geneva Convention's requirements for prisoner treatment created another layer of irony. These international agreements, designed to preserve human dignity in warfare, mandated treatment standards that exceeded what many African American soldiers experienced in their own country. Enemy prisoners received adequate nutrition by regulation, while black soldiers stateside often struggled to find restaurants that would serve them. Enemy prisoners received medical care by international law, while black civilians at home were turned away from hospitals. Despite these contradictions, or perhaps because of them, the 93rd Division medical units maintained exemplary standards. Their treatment of Japanese prisoners would be documented and found in compliance with all requirements. No accusations of mistreatment would emerge from prisoners they processed. The professionalism was absolute. This professionalism extended beyond medical care to the daily interactions. Corporal Thomas, the medic who administered morphine to the wounded Japanese soldier, had every personal reason for bitterness. He had joined the army in 1942 after his younger brother was beaten to death by police in Philadelphia for the crime of talking back to a white shopkeeper. No charges were filed. No investigation happened. The system offered his family no justice, yet Thomas treated wounded Japanese soldiers with a gentleness that some of them found confusing. His movements were careful when changing bandages, His voice was soft when explaining procedures through gestures. His presence was calming rather than threatening. The patients who recovered under his care carried memories that contradicted everything their indoctrination had promised. The 93rd Division medical units also included several African American nurses, though they were fewer in number and often assigned to treat American casualties rather than prisoners. These women faced triple discrimination, as African Americans, as women, and as military personnel in an era when female service members received minimal respect. Yet their professional competence matched any standard. Second Lieutenant Dorothy Hayes, one of the few African American nurses in the theater, occasionally assisted with prisoner treatment when medical needs exceeded available personnel. Her presence created additional cognitive dissonance for Japanese prisoners. The propaganda had taught them that Black Americans were barely educated, incapable of complex thought or professional skill. Lieutenant Hayes held a nursing degree from a prestigious Black college and demonstrated clinical competence that forced prisoners to question everything they had been taught. The Japanese military nurses, servants of empire. To understand the profound impact of their capture and treatment, one must understand what Japanese military nurses represented in their home culture and military system. They were not simply medical personnel, but embodiments of idealized Japanese womanhood, serving the sacred cause of empire. Japanese military nurses underwent rigorous selection and training. They were chosen for intelligence, dedication, physical stamina, and unquestioning loyalty to the emperor. Their training emphasized that their service was spiritual as much as practical, a sacred duty that transcended personal safety or survival. The nurses served throughout Japan's empire across the Pacific Islands, from Burma to the Philippines, from China to New Guinea. They worked in field hospitals under combat conditions, treating wounded soldiers often with inadequate supplies and impossible patient loads. Their dedication was legendary even among Allied forces who encountered their abandoned hospitals. Nurse Tanaka had been stationed at a field hospital near Clark Field, supporting Japanese forces fighting the American advance. As American forces approached, the hospital evacuated patients who could walk. Those too wounded to move were given fatal morphine doses according to Japanese military protocol, which preferred death to capture for wounded who could not be saved. The nurses were ordered to commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. Tanaka had intended to comply. She had the cyanide capsule that all nurses carried. She had written final letters to her family expressing her devotion and apologizing for any dishonor her service had failed to prevent. But in the confusion of the American advance, she found herself trapped in a damaged building without the means to carry out her planned suicide. American soldiers discovered her before she could try alternative methods. Her survival felt like failure. Her capture felt like betrayal of everything she represented. The fact that she was treated with medical competence and basic human dignity by the very people she had been taught to fear most created an identity crisis more profound than physical wounds. Other Japanese nurses processed through the same POW camps reported similar experiences. All had been prepared to die rather than surrender. All had been taught that capture meant unspeakable suffering. All discovered that reality contradicted their training. The psychological adjustment proved more difficult than physical recovery from wounds. The nurses' training had included specific warnings about African American troops, described as the most dangerous of enemy forces due to their alleged lack of civilization and discipline. The propaganda played on racial fears that had been cultivated in Japanese society as part of justifying their own imperialism across Asia. Japanese militarism had promoted the idea of Japanese racial superiority, with other Asians occupying middle positions and Black people relegated to the bottom of a fabricated hierarchy. Meeting African American medical personnel who demonstrated intelligence, education, professional competence, and human kindness shattered this propaganda structure completely. The blush that Nurse Tanaka experienced during her initial medical examination was the physical manifestation of her worldview collapsing. The blood that rose to her face reflected the shame of recognizing how thoroughly she had been deceived. February 21, 28, 1945. Extended captivity. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock of contradicted expectations evolved into deeper psychological transformation. The POW camp routines created ongoing opportunities for Japanese prisoners to recognize the gap between propaganda and reality. Daily medical checks meant daily interaction with African American medical personnel. Sergeant Mitchell saw Nurse Tanaka each morning to assess the healing of her arm wound. These brief clinical encounters became rituals of contradiction. Each time he unwrapped the bandage, examined the wound, applied fresh dressing, and rewrapped the arm, the same professional competence contradicted the same propaganda lies. Communication improved gradually. Nurse Tanaka began learning English words from the medical staff. "Better?" asked Sergeant Mitchell, pointing to her arm. "Better?" she repeated, then added in careful English, "Thank you." The simple exchange carried weight beyond its surface meaning. She was not just acknowledging medical treatment but beginning to recognize the humanity she had been taught to deny. Other interactions accumulated. Corporal Thomas taught several Japanese prisoners basic English phrases through gestures and repetition. Water, food, medicine, sleep. The language lessons became implicit lessons in humanity. Each word learned from someone propaganda had described as incapable of language undermined the propaganda's foundation. The food provided to prisoners exceeded minimum requirements. American military rations, while hardly luxurious, represented abundance compared to the diminishing supplies available to Japanese forces in the final months of the war. Prisoners received regular meals, adequate portions, and occasional additions like the chocolate bars that became symbols of contradicted expectations. Nurse Tanaka observed the African American soldiers when they thought they were not being watched. She saw them writing letters home, reading books, playing cards, joking with each other, expressing the full range of human behavior that propaganda had taught her they lacked. She saw them treating wounded American soldiers with the same care they showed Japanese prisoners, following the same protocols, maintaining the same professional standards. She also noticed the segregation within American forces. White officers commanded black enlisted men. White and black soldiers maintained separate social spaces even when working together. The racial hierarchy within American forces was visible even to prisoners who did not fully understand its implications. This observation created complex reactions. On one hand, the evidence of American racism seemed to confirm some elements of Japanese propaganda about Western moral corruption. On the other hand, the professional conduct of African American soldiers, despite their subordinate status, demonstrated a discipline and humanity that contradicted propaganda claims about their savagery. Lieutenant Hayes, the African American nurse, had a conversation with Nurse Tanaka through an interpreter late in February. Hayes asked about Tanaka's nursing training, her service experience, her medical knowledge. The professional exchange between two nurses who had been on opposite sides of a war revealed their common ground. Both had chosen demanding careers in service to their countries. Both had trained rigorously. Both understood the challenges of providing medical care under combat conditions. The conversation shifted something in Nurse Tanaka's understanding. Hayes was not just competent, but accomplished. Not just educated, but sophisticated in her professional knowledge. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. Everything Tanaka had been taught about racial hierarchy was proven false by the evidence standing before her discussing advanced nursing techniques. March 15, 1945. Transformation through treatment. By early March, Nurse Tanaka's physical wounds were healing well. The psychological wounds were in a different phase of their own healing process. She had moved from shock to recognition to a kind of angry grief. She had been lied to systematically about fundamental realities. The betrayal by her own propaganda system felt personal and profound. Other Japanese prisoners were experiencing similar transformations at different paces. Some adapted quickly, recognizing that survival required adjusting to new realities. Others struggled with shame and cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile their training with their experiences. A few remained defiant, insisting that their treatment was an elaborate deception preparing them for later torture that never came. The medical staff of the 93rd Division continued their professional routines. Sergeant Mitchell treated a steady flow of wounded prisoners as American forces cleared remaining Japanese resistance in Luzon. Each patient received the same protocol: assessment, treatment, documentation. The repetition of professional standards created an environment where contradicted propaganda became simply daily reality. The transformation happening in prisoners like Nurse Tanaka was not unique to those captured by African American units. Japanese prisoners throughout the Pacific Theater reported similar shock at professional treatment by American forces. However, the specific encounter between Japanese prisoners indoctrinated with anti-black propaganda and African American soldiers demonstrating professional competence created particular psychological impact. For the African American soldiers, the situation created its own complicated emotions. They were aware that their professional conduct was contradicting enemy propaganda. They could see the confusion and eventual recognition in prisoners' faces. This carried a satisfaction distinct from military victory, the satisfaction of disproving lies through simple human decency. But this satisfaction was tempered by awareness of continuing racism at home. Letters from family members brought news of ongoing discrimination, violence, and injustice in American cities. The same enemy prisoners they were treating with Geneva Convention standards would, in many cases, enjoy more freedom and better treatment in American POW camps than Black Americans experienced in their own communities. Sergeant Mitchell received a letter from his wife in early March describing how she had been denied service at a pharmacy in their Georgia hometown. She had needed medication for their sick child. The white pharmacist refused to serve her, telling her to go to the colored pharmacy across town. By the time she got there, the fever had worsened. The child recovered, but the incident highlighted the absurdity of Mitchell providing first-rate medical care to enemy soldiers, while his own family faced discrimination seeking basic health care. These contradictions weighed on the medical personnel, but did not diminish their professionalism. If anything, maintaining high standards became a form of silent protest, a demonstration of worth that required no words. Every Japanese prisoner treated competently was evidence against racial ideology, both the Japanese version and the American version. The propaganda war, promises, and reality. The systematic lying that Japanese prisoners encountered upon capture was part of a broader propaganda war that both sides waged throughout the Pacific conflict. Understanding this context illuminates why the contradiction between promise and reality proved so devastating to Japanese prisoners. Japanese propaganda about American treatment of prisoners served multiple strategic purposes. It discouraged surrender, which supported Japanese military doctrine emphasizing fight to the death rather than retreat or surrender. It maintained morale among troops who believed they were fighting inhuman enemies. It justified Japanese atrocities by preemptively accusing Americans of the same behavior. The specific propaganda about African American troops reflected Japanese attempts to exploit American racial divisions. Japanese broadcasts aimed at American forces sometimes highlighted racial injustice in the United States, attempting to undermine Black soldiers' loyalty. These broadcasts asked why African Americans would fight for a country that oppressed them, suggesting they should support Japan's vision of liberating Asian and African peoples from white colonialism. This propaganda strategy failed for several reasons. First, African American soldiers were aware of American racism and needed no Japanese broadcasts to inform them. Second, they understood that Japanese imperialism across Asia involved its own brutal racism and offered no liberation. Third, their loyalty was not to racist systems but to their communities, families, and own complex American identities. The propaganda also failed because reality contradicted it so completely. Japanese prisoners who had been taught that Americans, especially Black Americans, were savagely cruel discovered instead professional military conduct. The contrast was too stark to dismiss or rationalize. American propaganda efforts included leaflets dropped over Japanese positions promising good treatment if soldiers surrendered. Japanese troops were trained to dismiss these as lies. But as the war progressed and more prisoners experienced the gap between Japanese propaganda and American reality, word spread through informal channels. Some Japanese soldiers who were considering surrender sought capture by American forces rather than face starvation or hopeless final battles. The treatment of prisoners became psychological warfare in itself. Every Japanese prisoner who received professional treatment, adequate food, and medical care became a living contradiction of their propaganda training. When prisoners were eventually interviewed, as many were for intelligence purposes, they could report back to other prisoners about their experiences. The truth spread prisoner to prisoner, contradicting official propaganda more effectively than any leaflet. Nurse Tanaka, by mid-March, had become something of an informal liaison between Japanese prisoners and American medical staff. Her English had improved enough for basic communication. Her recognition that she would survive captivity had allowed her to begin thinking beyond immediate crisis. She found herself in the strange position of reassuring newly captured Japanese prisoners that the propaganda lies about torture and death were false. This role created new internal conflicts. Was she betraying her country by contradicting official propaganda? Or was she serving her fellow soldiers by helping them adjust to captivity and survival? The questions had no easy answers, but practical necessity pushed her toward choosing survival and truth over loyalty to proven lies. March 1631, 1945. Recognition and reconciliation. By late March, Nurse Tanaka had been a prisoner for over a month. Her arm wound had healed to the point where she no longer needed daily medical checks. Her psychological adjustment to captivity had progressed through shock, confusion, recognition, and into a phase of reluctant acceptance. She had come to know some of her captors as individuals rather than as propaganda categories. Sergeant Mitchell was from Georgia, had a wife and 2 children, had wanted to be a doctor but been denied admission to white medical schools and couldn't afford black medical schools, so became a medic instead. Corporal Thomas was from Philadelphia, had lost his brother to police violence, played trumpet before the war, and hoped to return to music after. Lieutenant Hayes was from Virginia, had graduated top of her nursing class, and wanted to open a clinic serving black communities when she returned home. These personal details accumulated into recognition of full humanity. The people she had been taught were demons turned out to be people with families, dreams, losses, and hopes. This should not have been revelatory, but propaganda is designed to obscure the obvious. Other Japanese prisoners were at different stages of similar recognition. Some adapted quickly, some resisted, some fell into depression at the collapse of their worldview. The medical staff treated all of them with the same professional standards regardless of their attitudes. The 93rd Division continued operations in Luzon through March and into spring. Medical and support units processed continuing flows of prisoners as American forces cleared Japanese resistance. The patterns established in February continued. Professional treatment, adequate care, contradiction of propaganda through routine procedure. In late March, a new group of prisoners included several Japanese nurses captured when a field hospital was overrun. Their processing followed the same protocols Nurse Tanaka had experienced. She watched as they went through the same shock, the same confusion, the same gradual recognition that propaganda had lied systematically. One of the newly captured nurses, a woman named Yoko Matsumoto, responded even more strongly than Tanaka had. When an African-American medic approached to examine her wounds, she flinched so violently, she reopened a partially healed cut. The medic gently cleaned and rebandaged the wound while she trembled, then offered her water and a chocolate bar. She took both with shaking hands, her face cycling through confusion, fear, and finally a deep blush of shame as she recognized the gap between expectation and reality. Tanaka spoke with Matsumoto later that day, helping her understand what captivity actually meant as opposed to what propaganda had promised. The conversation between 2 Japanese nurses about the humanity of their African-American captors marked a complete inversion of everything their training had taught them. April 1st to 30, 1945. The broader campaign. While individual prisoners experienced personal transformations, the larger Luzon campaign continued toward its conclusion. The 93rd Division's participation in the campaign was part of a massive American effort to reclaim the Philippines and position forces for a potential invasion of Japan itself. The division's combat elements had engaged Japanese forces in various sectors. Their support and medical units, including those processing prisoners, enabled the broader military mission. The professional treatment of prisoners served strategic purposes beyond humanitarian considerations: intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and maintaining international law compliance. By April, the flood of Japanese prisoners had slowed as organized resistance in Luzon diminished. Those prisoners already in custody, including Nurse Tanaka and her colleagues, faced uncertain futures. Would they be held for the war's duration? Transferred to other facilities? The uncertainty created anxiety, but the continued professional treatment provided some reassurance. The medical staff continued their routines. Sergeant Mitchell and his colleagues treated ongoing medical needs of the prisoner population: illnesses, minor injuries, chronic conditions. The daily medical practice became normalized, almost routine. The initial shock of contradicted propaganda faded into acceptance of present reality. For African American soldiers serving in the Pacific, news from home in April 1945 brought both hope and frustration. President Roosevelt's death on April 12 created uncertainty about civil rights progress. Roosevelt had been imperfect on racial justice, but had made some advances. His successor, Harry Truman, was unknown quantity. The news also brought reports of continuing racial violence and discrimination. A black veteran returning home to Georgia had been beaten for wearing his uniform in public. In Detroit, racial tensions over housing and jobs remained high. In the South, lynching continued despite federal anti-lynching legislation languishing in Congress. These reports created cognitive dissonance for African American soldiers. They were fighting for American victory, while America denied them basic rights. They were treating enemy prisoners according to Geneva Conventions while their families faced violence without legal protection. They were demonstrating professional competence and human decency while being classified as second-class citizens. Yet they continued serving with professionalism that contradicted both Japanese propaganda and American racism. Their conduct in the Luzon campaign and throughout the Pacific War would become part of the evidence that would eventually support the military desegregation that came in 1948. May 1–8, 1945. The European War ends. News reached the Pacific Theater on May 8, 1945, that Germany had surrendered. The European War was over. For soldiers in the Pacific, this meant that American focus and resources would now concentrate entirely on defeating Japan. It also meant that the war's end was approaching, though how much longer remained unknown. For Japanese prisoners, the news of Germany's defeat was devastating. Japan's alliance with Germany had been a cornerstone of Axis strategy. With Germany defeated, Japan stood alone against the combined might of Allied forces. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, only its duration and cost. Nurse Tanaka heard the news and understood its implications. Japan would lose. The empire would fall. Everything she had been taught about inevitable Japanese victory was proven false, like everything else propaganda had promised. The recognition brought not relief, but a profound grief for wasted lives and shattered certainties. The African American soldiers of the 93rd Division received the European victory news with mixed emotions. Joy that the war was partially won, mixed with awareness that their fight continued. Pride in Allied victory mixed with knowledge that returning African American veterans from Europe were already facing discrimination and violence at home. Sergeant Mitchell heard that his cousin, who had served with a quartermaster unit in France, had been denied service at a restaurant in Louisiana while traveling home on leave. He was in uniform, had just helped liberate Europe, and couldn't buy a sandwich in his home state. The bitter irony was not lost on Mitchell as he continued providing medical care to Japanese prisoners, according to Geneva Convention standards. May 9–31, 1945. Approaching endgame. With Germany defeated, planning intensified for the final assault on Japan. The 93rd Division's role in this phase remained unclear. Would they participate in the invasion of the Japanese home islands? Would they continue support and occupation duties? Uncertainty about future deployment added to the general anxiety of approaching war's end. For prisoners, the approaching endgame created different anxieties. What would happen to them when the war ended? Would they be repatriated to a defeated Japan? Would they face punishment for surviving when they had been trained to die rather than surrender? These questions had no answers yet. The medical care continued unchanged. Professional standards did not depend on war's phase or outcome. Sergeant Mitchell treated a Japanese prisoner's infected wound in late May with the same care he had provided in February. The consistency itself became a form of reassurance in an uncertain time. Nurse Tanaka had been in custody for over 3 months. She had healed physically, adapted psychologically, and begun thinking about what survival might mean long-term. She had learned significant English. She had developed working relationships with some of her captors. She had helped other prisoners adjust to captivity. She had become someone different from the person who had been captured in February. The transformation was not unique to her. Thousands of Japanese prisoners in American custody were undergoing similar psychological journeys. The professional treatment they received, so at odds with propaganda promises, was creating a generation of Japanese survivors who had experienced a different America than propaganda described. June–July 1945, Summer of Decision. The summer of 1945 brought intensifying operations against Japan itself. American bombers struck Japanese cities with increasing frequency and devastation. Naval forces blockaded Japanese shipping. Submarine warfare had nearly eliminated Japan's maritime commerce. The home islands faced starvation and collapse. In POW camps across the Pacific, Japanese prisoners listened to news and understood their homeland was being systematically destroyed. The propaganda that had promised inevitable victory was revealed as complete fiction. Japan was not winning. Japan was not going to win. Japan was being comprehensively defeated. The psychological impact on prisoners was profound. Many had survived captivity by clinging to hope that Japan would ultimately triumph and their ordeal would end in vindication. The summer of 1945 eliminated that hope. They had survived, but Japan was dying. Nurse Tanaka experienced this realization as another form of death. The country she had served, the empire she had believed in, the system that had shaped her identity was being destroyed. Her survival felt increasingly hollow. What was she surviving for? To return to a defeated Japan? To live as evidence of her nation's failure? The African-American soldiers guarding and caring for prisoners had their own summer of decision. Rumors circulated about the planned invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1945. Casualty estimates were enormous. Everyone understood that the final battle for Japan would be the bloodiest of the Pacific War. Sergeant Mitchell and his medical colleagues prepared for the anticipated flood of casualties from an invasion they hoped would not be necessary. Medical supplies were stockpiled, procedures were reviewed, contingency plans were drafted. The prospect of casualties on the scale of Normandy, or worse, haunted medical personnel who would be responsible for treating the wounded. August 5th, 1945. The final days. The first days of August 1945 saw continuing conventional bombing of Japan and ongoing preparations for invasion. For soldiers and prisoners alike, the war had taken on a quality of grinding inevitability. It would end with Japan's defeat, but at what cost, and when remained uncertain. Nurse Tanaka marked 6 months in captivity on August 5th. Half a year had passed since her capture near Clark Field. Half a year of contradicted propaganda, professional treatment, and psychological transformation. She was no longer the person she had been in February. The changes went deeper than language or daily routines. Her understanding of reality itself had been reconstructed. She had learned that propaganda lies, that racial hierarchies are fabrications, that enemies are humans, that survival is not betrayal. These lessons had been taught not through lectures, but through daily experience of being treated with professional competence and basic decency by people she had been trained to hate and fear. August 6th, 1945. Hiroshima. The news that reached POW camps in the days following August 6th was confusing and fragmentary. Something had happened to Hiroshima. A single bomb had destroyed the entire city. The details were unclear, but the implications were obvious. The war was approaching its end. For Japanese prisoners, the news brought horror and a kind of relief. Horror at the destruction, at the civilian casualties, at the revelation that America possessed weapons beyond comprehension. Relief that the war might end without the prolonged suffering of invasion and house-to-house fighting that would have killed millions more. Nurse Tanaka heard the news and thought of friends and family who might have been in Hiroshima. The uncertainty was agonizing. But beyond personal worry was a larger recognition. Japan had been absolutely defeated. The empire had gambled everything and lost everything. The propaganda had promised divine protection and inevitable victory. Instead came absolute defeat and incomprehensible destruction. August 9th, 1945. Nagasaki and surrender. A second atomic bomb struck Nagasaki on August 9th. Soviet forces invaded Manchuria the same day. Japan's situation became completely hopeless. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that many Japanese people heard the emperor's voice for the first time. In POW camps, Japanese prisoners listened to the surrender announcement with complex emotions. Relief that the war had ended, grief for their defeated nation, shame at surviving when so many had died, uncertainty about what surrender meant for their futures. Nurse Tanaka listened to the emperor's broadcast and wept. The war was over. Japan had lost. Everything she had believed about her nation's invincibility was proven false. But she was alive, and survival now had meaning. The war had ended. She could go home eventually, to whatever home remained and defeated Japan. For the African American soldiers of the 93rd Division, the surrender brought relief and pride. They had served honorably in a victorious cause. They had maintained professional standards throughout. They had contradicted enemy propaganda through their conduct. They had earned their place in the victory. But they also knew that returning to America meant returning to segregation, discrimination, and racism. The war they had won abroad would be followed by continuing struggles at home. The professional treatment they had extended to enemy prisoners would not be reciprocated by their own nation's institutions. August 1631, 1945. Aftermath. The days following surrender brought practical questions about repatriation, occupation duties, and transition to peace. For prisoners, the end of war meant eventual return home, though the logistics would take months to arrange. Nurse Tanaka had a final conversation with Sergeant Mitchell in late August as the POW camp began processing prisoners for eventual repatriation. Through improved English and with the help of an interpreter, she tried to express what 6 months in his care had meant. She thanked him for the medical treatment, for the professional competence, for the human decency that had contradicted everything she had been taught to expect. She apologized for the propaganda lies she had believed, for the hatred she had been trained to feel, for the dehumanization her nation had practiced. Mitchell listened and nodded. He understood, better than she perhaps realized, how propaganda works to dehumanize enemies. He had experienced American propaganda's version his entire life, being taught that he was inferior, less intelligent, less human than white Americans. He had learned through his own experience how lies persist until reality contradicts them directly. He wished her well in her return to Japan. He hoped she would find family alive and home standing. He hoped the peace would be real and lasting. He hoped the lessons learned through 6 months of professional treatment would outlast the bitterness of defeat. They shook hands. A simple gesture that would have been unthinkable in February when Nurse Tanaka had blushed with shame at recognizing her propaganda training had been built on lies. The handshake between former enemies symbolized the transformation that professional treatment and basic human decency could achieve. Epilogue. The meaning of a blush. That moment in February 1945 when Nurse Tanaka blushed as Sergeant Mitchell touched her wounded arm during medical examination contained layers of meaning that would take months to fully understand. The blush was not from fear, though fear was present. It was not from pain, though she was wounded. It was not even primarily from modesty, though that played a role. The blush was the physical manifestation of cognitive dissonance so profound it produced physiological response. Years of propaganda training collided with present reality in a moment of recognition that could not be denied or rationalized. The enemy she had been taught was a subhuman demon, demonstrated human compassion and professional competence. The fate she had been promised was torture and death. The reality she experienced was medical care and basic dignity. That recognition, that moment of propaganda collapsing under the weight of contradicting reality, produced the heat that rose to her face and the color that revealed her inner transformation. The blush was shame, not at present circumstances, but at recognizing how thoroughly she had been deceived by her own nation's propaganda. Thousands of other Japanese prisoners experienced similar moments of recognition throughout the Pacific War. The professional treatment they received from American forces, including and especially from African American units like the 93rd Division, contradicted propaganda and created psychological transformations more profound than military defeat. For the African American soldiers who provided this professional treatment, the irony was bitter and ongoing. They extended to enemy prisoners the human dignity that was denied them at home. They demonstrated competence and compassion that contradicted both Japanese propaganda and American racism. They served with honor in a system that dishonored them. The 93rd Infantry Division would return to the United States and be deactivated in 1946. The individual soldiers would return to segregated America, where their military service provided no protection against discrimination. Many would face violence, economic hardship, and systemic racism that mocked their sacrifice. But their service, and particularly the professional treatment they extended to Japanese prisoners, became evidence in the long struggle for civil rights. The military began desegregation in 1948, driven partly by recognition that African American soldiers had served with distinction in World War II. The Japanese prisoners who experienced their professional care carried memories that contradicted racial ideology. Nurse Tanaka would return to Japan in early 1946, to a nation occupied, defeated, and transformed. She would find that her family had survived, though their home had burned in American bombing. She would resume nursing work, this time in civilian hospitals treating Japanese patients recovering from war's devastation. She would tell her story occasionally, usually when asked by younger Japanese who wanted to understand the war. She would describe the propaganda she had been taught and the reality she experienced. She would describe the African American medic from Georgia, who treated her wounds with professional competence and basic kindness when propaganda had promised her only torture and death. And she would describe that moment, that first examination, when his hand touched her arm and she blushed crimson, not from fear, not from pain, but from the sudden recognition that everything she had been taught was a lie, and that the enemy she had been trained to hate was treating her with a humanity and professionalism that her own propaganda had denied was possible. That blush became the symbol of propaganda's collapse, of ideology defeated by simple human decency, of walls built by lies crumbling under the touch of compassion. It was a small moment in a vast war, but it contained within it the proof that even the most comprehensive indoctrination cannot withstand the evidence of direct human experience. The African American soldiers of the 93rd Division demonstrated through their professional conduct that racial hierarchies are built on lies, whether Japanese lies about Black Americans or American lies about Black Americans. They proved that competence and compassion transcend the categories that propaganda creates. They showed that maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies is possible and necessary, and in doing so, they created moments like that February morning in Luzon, when a Japanese nurse blushed at the recognition that propaganda had lied, that enemies were human, and that the touch of a skilled medic's hand represented not the torture she had been promised, but the medical care that honored her basic human dignity, despite everything that war and propaganda had tried to destroy. That moment, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater in various forms, represented the quiet victory of human decency over systematic dehumanization. It was a victory as significant as any military triumph, achieved not through violence, but through the simple act of treating wounded enemies according to professional standards and basic human compassion. The blush was recognition. The blush was shame at years of false belief. The blush was the beginning of transformation. The blush was the color of propaganda collapsing and humanity emerging. The blush was proof that even in war, even after years of indoctrination, even between designated enemies, the direct experience of human kindness can overcome the lies that systems build to justify hatred. And that remains the lesson decades later. Propaganda is powerful, but ultimately fragile when confronted with contradicting reality. Racial hierarchies are pervasive, but ultimately false when confronted with evidence of common humanity. Hatred is easily taught, but can be unlearned through direct experience of the humanity in those we have been taught to hate. The African American soldiers of the 93rd Division taught that lesson, not through speeches or propaganda of their own, but simply through maintaining professional standards and basic human decency, even toward enemies who had been taught to see them as demons. Their quiet professionalism became the most effective counter-propaganda possible, the undeniable reality of competent and compassionate treatment that no lie could explain away. And thousands of Japanese prisoners, including nurses like Tanaka, who blushed at the recognition of how thoroughly they had been deceived, carried those lessons back to post-war Japan, where they became part of the foundation for rebuilt understanding. The transformation of enemies into humans through the simple act of professional medical care and basic dignity proved more powerful than any military victory in changing hearts and minds. That is why the blush matters. That is why the moment of recognition, embarrassment, and transformation deserves remembering. It represents the possibility of overcoming even the most systematic dehumanization through the practice of simple humanity. It represents hope that lies, no matter how comprehensively taught, cannot withstand the evidence of direct human kindness. The war ended in 1945. The propaganda was defeated along with the military forces. But the lesson remains. Humans who are taught to hate can learn otherwise through direct experience of the humanity, In those they have been trained to despise. The touch of a medic's hand, the offer of a chocolate bar, the professional competence of medical examination, the basic dignity of adequate care, these simple acts proved more powerful than years of indoctrination. And the blush, that moment of recognition when propaganda collapsed and reality could not be denied, remains the symbol of transformation possible even in the midst of war, even between enemies, even after years of systematic lies. It remains proof that human decency persists even in humanity's darkest moments, and that maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies represents not weakness, but the highest form of strength, the strength to remain human when everything encourages you to become something less. If this story of humanity overcoming propaganda moved you, please subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history that challenge everything we think we know about war, race, and human nature. Hit that like button if you believe these forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Did this story change your perspective on WTO? What other hidden histories would you like us to uncover? Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people who need to hear them. Subscribe, like, and comment. Let's keep history alive together.